Good afternoon, everyone. You're welcome to yet another podcast that we're organizing, that Green the Map podcast, primarily looking at sustainability and resilience in these times of COVID, or otherwise as well. It's very, very important to talk about sustainability and resilience. And today we have a very, very special guest, a special friend as well, Neha Sinha. Neha Sinha actually heads conservation at BNHS. Prior to that, of course, she's been a journalist in her previous, whatever avatar in that sense. Of course, is a commentator on environmental issues, has written quite a few books, and I have one of them right now in my hand. And of course, we'll be talking about this. And a lot of times, as in when I look at Neha's work and her commentary, it's about different issues. So it's not just about dams and rivers and mountains and big issues, but the smaller issues that perhaps get neglected a lot of times. And today we're actually going to talk about perhaps in the environmental landscape or in the conservation landscape or in activism landscape, so to say, we do not talk about bees. We hardly talk about butterflies. And other than a few great Instagram photos of birds, there's no conversation about birds as well. So Neha, welcome to this podcast. And I'm glad you agreed to be part of this. And today, Neha, we're going to be talking about birds, bees, and butterflies. And I couldn't have thought of someone better than you to be part of this.
Thank you for having me. And this is my favorite topic to talk about. So thanks.
So Neha, before we actually get into the actual topic and discuss birds, bees, and butterflies and its connection or its linkages with issues of our planet, of our land, of our water, of our food process, how did this all begin for you? As in, I'm slightly intrigued, not so intrigued, but a little interested to know that being a journalist, of course, you covered environment very, very, you used to write for environment. How did this shift to BNHS or the world of conservation full time and this world of bees, monkeys, butterflies, snakes, everything start?
It started when I was a little child growing up in Delhi, and I grew up in Delhi, and I was lucky to have a big garden. And I was one of those children who always was outside rather than being inside. And I was very fascinated by all the wildlife in the garden. And as I grew older, I realized that all the wildlife was kind of going away. So it's the smallest, as you said, the small things first. It's the small things that show up first as indicators. So after the rainfall, particular kinds of insects used to come. There used to be locusts, which kind of disappeared as I grew older. The bird diversity from the garden, it really came down. And I started noticing changes in my environment around me. And there used to be jackals near my house because my house is close to the northern ridge. And every evening we could hear them laughing, like the call that a jackal makes is like laughter. And we could hear peacocks calling as well, and they sound like cats. They make this meowing sound. And as I grew older, I realized that landscape was gone. And it's kind of like an ecological grief, It's like when you find the baseline shifting. So you've worked so much on Yamuna, and you've seen how it is at Wazirabad before it enters Delhi, or just as it enters Delhi, and how it becomes as it moves towards Okhla, which is the last point, right? So children in Delhi who haven't seen the Yamuna at the Yamunotri, all those kids you've taken to Yamunotri would have a different ecological understanding. And in a single lifetime, or even less than that, you can have a complete shift of landscape. So I knew that the stuff that I loved as a kid was already gone. And this is, of course, the capital of the country. And over here, development is always prioritized. So it's always going to be, that building is more important than the tree or the wetland or the river, right? And I wanted to see if I could give back in some way. I wanted to be involved in trying to plan for a country or a city which takes wildlife into account. And I really want to make wildlife visible, which is actually the motive behind my book as well. And as a journalist, a lot of my stories were negative because environmental coverage, it's really like it's pollution and poaching and all of that loss. It's about loss. And so I think it was just one day that I just decided that I wanted to see if I could get involved in the other side, which is actually being part of the environmentalist community.
Perfect. So Neha, we will talk about some of those negative things as well, because no conversation on conservation is complete unless and until you actually talk about the challenges or the threats in that sense. But before that, I just want to tell all our viewers about this beautiful book that I just ordered. It's called Wild and Wilful, written by Neha. And Neha, there's quite a few sections in this. Of course, I've not read all, and because I was about to talk to you today, so I read portions of your section called The Sky, or Sky, actually, and there are two chapters in that. One is The Tiger of the Garden, and the other is Letters in the Sky. I, in particular, liked the way you've actually written about bullets and Chhattisgarh and Naxals and butterflies and your house in Model Town, many of those things. And of course, in your first description right now, you've talked about how it's not education of butterflies, it's the observation of your surrounding that makes you an expert or an observer of sorts on issues of environment or issues of ecology in that sense. Tell us a little about this book and specifically this section about birds and butterflies that you've actually written here.
I wanted to tell the story of wild animals in India, and of course there's so many of them. So I wanted to break it down as per habitat to sort of little bit cover, the diversity that we have. So sky is the birds and the butterflies, things that fly in the sky. And water is the dolphin, the Gangetic dolphin, which is endemic to India. Then, of course, there's land. So you have tigers and leopards and elephants that I write about in the book. And there's also heart. So heart is animals that live in our heart or animals that we eject from our heart, meaning those that we feel we have a relationship with, and or some that we decide we should not have a relationship with them. We should cull them or hunt them. So the idea is to talk about the agency of the wild animal as well. The idea is to see if the history of India can also be the history of wild animals and actually also the ecosystem. So, I mean, it's a very far, perhaps we need to evolve a lot before we can consider ecosystems to be something in their own right. Like the river having a right to flow, for example. And when we talk about the sky, I think, the sky, it's there in our Instagram posts, the sunset, the sunrise, and beautiful cloud photographs, especially during this time of the year when there are lots of clouds in the sky. But the sky is also something that should be unhindered. So the electric lines in the sky are a huge problem for birds today. And some of our most endangered birds, the big ones, are getting electrocuted or they die on collision with wires. So great Indian bustard and big birds of prey are dying because there are too many wires. So, I mean, just think whether you have any pictures without wires in it, possibly no matter where you go, even if it's the jungle or whether it's the desert, there are wires. And butterflies also, it's interesting because we look at them as something that comes to our garden, like almost like a tame thing, because a child learns to draw and the first thing they draw is a butterfly on a flower. But butterflies are also wild animals. So they're as wild as the tiger, the leopard, the elephant, and they need particular kinds of plants to lay eggs on. So even in the rewilding that you are doing, a certain butterfly will come on a certain plant. So they're very plant specific, and they also make corridors that they follow. So butterflies migrate as well, just like birds do, and people don't know about that. So the butterflies in Chhattisgarh, for example, are a living link between the Eastern Ghats and other parts of India. And even though Chhattisgarh and that bustard landscape has so much conflict, butterflies are somehow surviving, and I think butterflies show us how the landscape is still linked. And as far as Delhi is concerned, a small butterfly garden that you make could be a corridor for a butterfly that has come from very far away. So we do have butterflies coming from Rajasthan to Delhi, and we have butterflies crossing from Eastern Ghats to Western Ghats every year. They're so small, very fragile, but they're also migratory. And I think if you can think about the sky as being something that doesn't only belong to airspace that's ours, and if we begin to observe wildlife around us, I think it leads us to perhaps a way to live our own life in a way. I think animals can teach us a lot about being human and about taking less space and not behaving as if we own everything and we control everything, because we don't. And when I observe birds, butterflies, which are easy to see in the city, I think it also slows down my sense of hectic city life, in which everything is a rat race.
Interesting, Neha. So, or for our viewers, for our listeners, something very interesting that you just mentioned, that mostly we think that a bird or a butterfly hops from one tree to another because they look so pale and they look so small. But in reality, they actually migrate from almost one state to another, in many cases, one country to another, or one continent to another as well. And we only see that bird in our balcony, or in your case, you said 11th floor of a Dwarka complex. But there is a lot. These would be very fragile, pale-looking beings, but they actually are very, very robust. And of course, in your book, you've actually you've compared it to a bullet couldn't really harm a butterfly in that sense. Now, something that you mentioned in your second intervention about tigers, leopards, elephants, and lions. Why is it so that every time we talk about conservation, and I know that you head conservation at BNHS, so it's not specifically to BNHS, this particular question, but every time when we talk about conservation, there's always conversation about conservation of tigers, or conservation of leopards, or conservation of these beautiful Getty Getty image elephants, I mean, in the sense elephants that's been shot by great Getty photographers in that sense, but very little about extincting or missing, a sparrow or a particular species of butterfly that's not found. Why is not so much conversation, and I was slipping and saying conservation, and that's also right. Why is there not so much conservation or conversation around these little beings that are very, very critical? We'll come back to, and I'll ask you specific question later of what's their actual contribution, but why is there lesser conservation?
We like size and we like beauty, and I think the bigger something is, the more it catches our attention. I think generally speaking, the charismatic animals are usually the big ones. So there's a reason why the panda is, a symbol of conservation. Even though panda is only found in one part of the world, but panda is a symbol of global conservation. And tigers and leopards and lions are big. They're called the kings of the jungle, and we like that sense of bigness. So of course, we don't like it very close to us. We want it to only be in Corbett Tiger Reserve. It shouldn't come near us. And even in the leopard chapter, the leopards in Delhi, and we don't want them. We've removed them in the past, and we probably want to remove them again. And I think what happens is the smaller animals can be much more critical to conservation in many ways, because we see them in our daily life, and to be able to foster policy or practice in our own lives, it would be much more connected to birds and butterflies, right? Because we're not living with tigers and leopards. Particularly in the city, it's hard to imagine. There are leopards in Bombay, many of them, but generally speaking, it's birds and butterflies we would see first. And birds and butterflies that we can focus on in urban areas, because it can help us towards sustainable living, having gardens that don't have chemicals, and it can also, help in making people understand that policy has to take ecology into consideration. So even if you're planning rewilding a forest or making a garden, it should be an ecologically viable thing. It shouldn't just be, exotic species brought in from America or whatever. It has to perform an ecological function and be useful for the native birds and bees, right? And I think in that sense, the small things can be really useful for our planning. But I think we just like, the glamour of the big stuff. And you have lion safari after lion safari that's made in India. There's a lion safari in Itawa. But we don't have a second habitat for lions. In reality, Gujarat will not part with its lions, but we like the big safaris and seeing the big animals. Don't really care for the rest.
Okay, so for our viewers and for everybody's understanding, I think it's very, very important to highlight that it's not romantic reasons why we need to conserve our bees and our butterflies. A lot of times, one of the reasons why we actually find many of our species not being respected or being culled or being not conserved is because our current generation or our future generation, our younger generation, doesn't understand the relevance / significance / importance of a bee in our larger food cycle or in our larger ecology. Just for our viewers, if you could just educate all of us, how does it actually help? As in, this entire pollination process, cross-pollination process, entire food production regime that we actually have on the planet, and the contribution that actually bees and butterflies actually make. So if you could just scientifically explain to everyone, this is not just a great Instagram photo. It's something that is on our table, our healthy food, our variety of food. All of it is actually linked to butterflies and birds and bees.
Yeah. I mean, there are two aspects. One is how useful something is, and that's why we should protect it. And the other is something also deserves to be protected because it exists on the planet. And not everything needs to be of use to us or appeal to us. But, in terms of use, we cannot pollinate our crops without things that fly. So bats pollinate crops. Bees are one of the biggest pollinators. We cannot do without them for our food, for the stuff that we grow. And even birds are extremely important because they eat the pests that attack our crops. We cannot cover everything with pesticide and insecticide because we will be poisoning our own cells. And we always need birds. After a particular sparrow went extinct in China, they had a pest population, a huge pest population, and the rice crop could not do well. And in places where birds go extinct locally, there are too many pests, and even owls eat rats that eat our grains. We cannot, it's not possible for us to be clearing our crops of pests. And we are a country that depends on agriculture so much. It's such an important primary vocation for most of our population. For us, the butterflies, the birds, and the bees are extremely important for pollination and for pest control. And having said that, the other thing is, and then I would say as an ecologist, is that something also deserves to live because it's there on Earth. Not everything needs to be something that is of use to us. And there's an altruistic value also of creatures that are amongst us and are part of our ecosystem. And there's so many native Indian animals that are found only in India. So there are kinds of hornbills or corals or orchids that are only found here. And we have a duty to protect them because that's a kind of ecological patriotism that we should also have, It's important. And once something goes extinct, it takes us many years to understand what impact it has in the food chain. And if a particular bee goes extinct, crops will suffer. And again, in parts of China, people are hand pollinating crops with a brush and pollen because there's a huge crash in insect populations. And now imagine hand pollinating things. Like, it sounds like an employment generator, but really it's not. It's, because again, it takes us many years to understand what is the impact of a local extinction. So safe to say that generally speaking, native species that are found in that place should be allowed to live. And they are part of the ecosystem that includes our agriculture, because agriculture in many ways is now part of our ecosystem. It's part of the natural processes of pollination. And there's no pest control like birds. Birds are very important pest control. We need birds as well.
Exactly. So Neha, I just want to share an example of, a lot of times we think that something which is a nuisance to our comfort, any particular being that's a nuisance to our comfort, it could be a lizard or a cockroach or even a mosquito, we want to just get rid of it without realizing, without even understanding that what role that perhaps that species has in the larger food cycle or larger ecological cycle. And one example of that is many, many years ago, something that I heard about is that in New Friends colony, people found lots and lots of frogs coming to their homes because, Yamuna was getting flooded and that area, there were lots and lots of frogs. So what they actually did is they all got together, the RWAs, the new, the cup panchayats of kinds, and actually killed all the frogs. They got a particular kind of a chemical and sprayed and killed all the frogs. That year was the worst dengue attack that New Friends colony actually had, because they couldn't understand the cycle of frogs and mosquitoes, and they killed all the frogs. But then that's where all the mosquitoes were anyway allowed to live. And that imbalance, so a lot of times it's the utility of things that a particular purpose, like for example, pollination that we talk about here, or carrier of a seed that we talk about in many cases. And sometimes it's actual cycle, the food cycle that gets abrupted, and that has an impact. Now, a lot of times when we talk about birds, bees, and butterflies, or about environment, we talk about the shrinking sky space or land space, or this entire urbanization, concretization. A lot of environmentalists and a lot of people like yourself and others have actually said that, one of the reasons why there's a huge threat to several species is because of over expanding, over exaggerating, over, intruding concrete in our lives. And as for you, what's the impact that urbanization or rapid urbanization or haphazard urbanization that has on survival, existence, or well-being of our birds, bees, and butterflies?
The well-being of all these animals is closely linked to our well-being as well. And if you talk about Delhi, because we're both in Delhi, look at the way the Yamuna has been treated. And why is the Yamuna so black in color? Why is it so ecologically dead? Because it's actually ecologically dead when it is in Delhi. That is because we don't treat it like a river, we treat it like a drain. There's also another river in Delhi called Sahibi, which many people have forgotten about, which is now known as the Nala, but it's actually a river of the Aravallis. And because there's so much sewage and industrial effluent in it, it looks like a drain and it smells like a drain. And now the thing is, urbanization in itself doesn't need to be a bad thing, but it always has to be planned. It has to allow also for natural infrastructure to continue the way it's continuing. So drainage, for example, is a very good way of understanding what natural infrastructure is. So low-lying areas, seasonal streams that come after the monsoon, they should be allowed to flow, because that is something that nature has created. In areas that are low-lying or areas with the channels of water, if you cover them, you're going to be flooded, first of all. Second of all, you are depriving the river of the nurseries of gastropods or other creatures that will join the river because of the seasonal floods and the seasonal streams. So you have seasonal streams, for example, going through IIT, you have seasonal streams going through Delhi Ridge and the Aravallis around Delhi, so Bunsi, Mangar, etc. And the more we try to control this natural infrastructure, the more we see extreme things happening. So with climate change, you are going to have more rainfall in the Himalayas. That's one of the predictions of the Ministry of Earth Sciences in India. And if you're going to have increased rainfall, you're going to have increased landslides, increased flooding, and also perhaps increased drought in certain parts of India. So how do we prepare for this? One is making our wetlands deeper or emptying them partially before the rain. But the other is to not block natural drainage. Because there's this whole idea that we should channelize rivers and concretize them. When you say concretization, it's a very important way of understanding what we're doing to a city. So I was in Raipur, I think, yes, it was Raipur, and it was raining heavily. So they've made this new road, and there's no drainage. There's no drainage on both sides of the road. So the central verge is really high, the footpath is really high. So the road actually becomes like a canal when it rains. So a simple thing like planning a road, and you know this better than me having worked in Yamuna, where does the water go? How can you plan a city without considering where does water go? Now, just because it rains only 1 month of the year in Delhi, it doesn't mean that we can, forget these things. Absolutely. And even in Gurgaon, the underpasses are always underwater.
Yeah, we've actually seen this in the last couple of weeks in Delhi itself. As in, imagine Delhi, the way we had roads were flooded, and primarily because you've actually constructed on the natural waterways. You've encroached upon the natural habitat. You think that the roads are broader, but no, you've actually taken over the natural waterways, and that has an impact. And the other is, in the case of bees and birds and butterflies, that these natural habitats for our birds to actually feed from or come and rest or sunbathe or to just exist or to migrate to, many of those have actually shrunk, and because of this urbanization. So if you cut a forest, you think it's just a piece of land with some things growing, but it's actually habitat of several birds, several species, several owls, several bats, several things that's actually important for us that is actually going. My last question, because we only have 2 more minutes, 3 more minutes in that sense. From a resilience point of view, as we've seen COVID, we've seen how things have been extremely, extremely bad and unpredictable. And it's been more bad for the poorest of the poor, in the sense, of course, oxygen level can go down for everyone, but access to perhaps a particular oxygen cylinder is different for different class of people. Overall, from in the context of COVID, how do you look at resilience, environment, public health, specific to the kind of topic that we're talking about? How do we link ecology and resilience?
So the first thing to remember is that, as we understand it, COVID probably happened because we stressed out an animal, right? So when animals get stressed out, they can drop viruses into the atmosphere. And there was an intermediate host for the animal that got stressed out. So the intermediate host was a pangolin. And so it probably came from a bat to a pangolin. And there's a lot of research on the spread of disease that says that if you are going to destroy natural habitat, you are going to release new viruses into the air, because animals get stressed. That's how Nipah happened as well. And they are natural carriers of viruses which don't normally come into the atmosphere, but they will if they have a lot of cortisol, if they are stressed a lot. So that's the first thing to remember. The second thing is that any kind of climate action needs to rely on nature-based solutions. So you need to have resilience towards all these storms that are coming, towards the droughts that are coming, the landslides, the hill slides that are happening. And you cannot engineer everything yourself. So if we want to stabilize the Himalayas through an engineering method, it cannot be done. The scale is just enormous. You want to stabilize the coast against tsunamis, it cannot be done. You need mangroves on the coast. You need forest cover on the Himalayas. And we need to rely and go back to the wisdom of letting nature handle some of the worst kind of events of climate variability, which we are facing right now. So all this flooding in September, I cannot remember, it's 77 years it hasn't rained this much in September in Delhi. And all over India, there are always floods, there are always droughts, right? Every year. And there's a tropical cyclone coming every year now to India. And sometimes 2. This year we had 2 of them. So we need to rely on nature-based solutions, which means that we need to create ecosystems that can handle these kind of storm surges. And it's important to remember that we cannot do what nature does. It just is not possible, neither in terms of scale, nor in terms of any impact, because whatever we build cannot withstand the elements for too long, right?
Absolutely.
So even if you build that sea wall to protect yourself, it's going to crumble one day, because the sun and the rain nothing can stand against it. So, climate solutions and climate action and environmental action should have natural ecosystems as a bedrock. So if we want also to deal with the oxygen crisis and the crisis of so many millions of people recovering from COVID, we need clean air. And in fact, I had COVID this year in April, and the only time I felt better was when it rained and the air cleared, because otherwise this is the world's most polluted place. And if you're going to keep cutting trees, it comes down to also our local action. If you're going to cut trees for every project, the Butterfies trees that will go for the Delhi Metro, for example, the trees that will go for Central Vista, the people who live there, dealing with respiratory ailments because of COVID, and also before that, there's so many people with respiratory ailments. What happens at that micro level? So even at the microclimate level, we need to have these natural ecosystems to help you just live a more healthy life.
Absolutely.
No matter how many air filters you have or how many N95 masks you have, what can substitute clean air?
Absolutely. So what you're saying is right, and in conclusion, that resilience cannot be actually manufactured in a lab. What nature provides a lot of times is a thankful, unnoticed contribution that nature has towards our life, towards our well-being, towards our public health, towards our public ecology. And a lot of times we don't understand that, and that's our ignorance. So sometimes we know that our clean air or our water recharge happens through trees and old trees, but still because of our greed and aspiration and this growth mania, we're actually on a spree to really almost kill the planet in that sense. So thank you, Neha, for taking our time and talking about so many things from COVID to birds, bees, butterflies. And I hope, as you rightly said, we should have more and more of these conversations. Today, of course, we start with bees and butterflies, but maybe perhaps next conversation will be about the sweet-looking monkeys of the rich. Thanks a lot, and thank you, viewers, for being with us. Thank you, Neha.